In the course of my career, which it's incredible, spans 30 years, I've had the opportunity to consider the auditor's role from a few perspectives. One is I've been audited. Another perspective on internal audit that I've got is I've worked with auditors at all levels to help them hone their methodology and their change agent skills. And most recently, I've had the perspective from the audit committee. I'm a former audit committee chair. And so when we think about this topic about managing people in crisis, I think that we have to keep thinking about, wow, we're all knowledge workers. And, hey, what is this really, what does this really mean? So when we look at the topic for today, what are we going to cover in this webinar? I'm going to start with who's likely, who's susceptible, literally, who's a target for experiencing crisis? Because let's face it, good auditors like to be preventive, not only detective in their approach to things. I also want to focus in on the employer-employee relationship and how that can help or hinder dealing with people who are experiencing crisis. And I want to talk about the different views on performance, the view from the employer side. I want to talk about it also from the coworkers side, because right now, even as we're going through this webinar, the person sitting next to you, you might not realize it, but they might be dealing with some tough stuff. So on a practical level, to wrap out the webinar, I want to focus in on some very practical actions that you can take that will make it easier to work through any type of life-altering event or crisis that is happening. And for those of you that just joined the webinar, I just want to repeat something that Ashley said at the start of the webinar, and that is there is an attachment button. It's either on top of your screen or to the left. If you're interested in downloading the slides or the article, because this webinar was based on an article that I wrote and was published by Protiviti in Knowledge Leader. So with that said, you also have the opportunity to ask questions, and I will be saving time at the end to answer some questions, any questions that you have. So with that, let's kind of dive right in. Today's workplace, we stop and think about it, whether you're an auditor, whether you're working in compliance, whether you're a manager, whether you're staff to the audit. If you think about your day, from the time you wake up, you're making decisions all the time. You're making decisions that affect the scope of the audit. You're making decisions about, is this test result an isolated incident? You're making decisions with regard to the outcomes of your projects. You're making decisions about opinions in your reports. Basically, you're thinking all of the time. So the issue really is what happens to the quality of these decisions when the people who are making these choices are really preoccupied, in essence, really zoned out. And then what happens when this situation goes unnoticed? No one realizes that literally the knowledge worker is asleep at the switch. And so you can easily imagine that this can create problems. This can definitely create just a whole host of challenges. And I think that this issue, managing people in crisis, becomes very important because we are surrounded by knowledge workers. Now, I don't know if this will interest you, but I did want to disclose that the genesis of this article and the research was a result of several things that happened to me all at about the same time last year. So we had Hurricane Sandy, for those of you who are in the Northeast and along the East Coast, still devastating effects of that storm. On a personal level, 14 days without power. And at that time, while I was without power, my mom was suffering from what turned out to be a fatal illness. So I lost my mom in November. And meanwhile, as all of this is going on, even in the dark, I'm working. I think I'm working. I'm teaching. And then it occurred to me, I think I'm in a bit of a fog. You know, I feel a little bit disconnected. And as I would talk to people and obviously share this calamitous news. Oh, by the way, at around the same time, I also took a ball in the eye, a tennis ball in the eye. So just really rounded out the holiday season. And I just kept going, you know, like the little Energizer bunny. But as I started to run into others who, when they heard about what I was going through, they would share incidents that they were experiencing. And it was fascinating to me to start to hear patterns in how they were describing their feelings. And that got me thinking, wow, I wonder if there are some warning signs for people going through crisis. So with that, before I go any further, we have our first polling question. And just as a reminder, if you are interested in CPE credit, we can offer 1 credit of CPE if you complete 4 out of 5 polling questions. So this is your first chance. Ashley, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Ann. So everyone, first poll question, and I'm going to change it to the voting screen now. First question is, how do you spot the warning sign of people in a crisis? There it is at the bottom of the list. So a couple of different options here. A, you can't. There are no warning signs. B, any break from a person's ordinary response is a warning sign. C, it depends on the person. D, I don't know. Just take a quick moment to answer this question, particularly if you want to be eligible to receive CPE. As I mentioned before, you have to answer 4 out of 5. Give you another few seconds here. Going to stop the voting and just show you all the results. And as you can see, it looks like the most popular answer here is C. It depends on the person. And then other people think it'd be a break from a person's ordinary response is a warning sign. So back to you then.
Super. Well, so actually those of you that picked B is actually the best answer. And next best answer is C. So B, any break from a person's ordinary response, best answer. Next best answer is C. So there really are warning signs. Now, if you weren't sure, well, I could understand that. I could understand that, and that might be why you're participating in this webinar, to figure out what are the warning signs, and we will cover that. But let's start with talking about the definition of a crisis. And as part of my research, I went to Webster. Now, some of you might have thought, gee, why didn't she use Wikipedia? But I happen to think that Merriam-Webster is probably a better source. So if you look at this definition, I want to highlight a couple of aspects of the definition. Couple of things. Emotionally significant events, radical change, unstable or crucial time, distinct possibility of a highly undesirable outcome. I mean, if you think about it from an audit perspective, notice the inherent subjectivity of these conditions. What's emotionally significant to one person might not be to another. So if we think about this definition and we now start to apply it, I think that we have to admit that there's a number of events that could be considered a crisis. Marriage, getting married, job change, relocating, especially if you're relocating a distance, divorce. I mean, for some people, moving their office could become a crisis. So the types of crises or life-altering events span a pretty far range. So then, okay, if many things could potentially be a crisis, the next question becomes, who's likely to experience a crisis? And that takes us to our second polling question. In your opinion, what do you think? Ashley, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, sure, Ann. So who's likely to experience a crisis? We've got some age ranges here and then some options about people living in different kinds of areas. So let me turn on the view where you can answer this question. So answer A, people between the ages of 20 and 30. B, 30 to 50. C, over 50. D, people living in metropolitan areas. Or E, people living in suburban rural areas. Who do you think is likely to experience a crisis? Give you just a couple of minutes to... So I'm going to stop the voting now, and we can take a look at the results. It looks like the top vote getter is people between the ages of 30 and 50. Half of our respondents say that those are the people most likely to experience a crisis, which is funny, isn't it? Because on our first version of this poll, we didn't even have that answer. And I said, that's me. I think we should include that because, you know, I feel like I'm in a crisis every other day. And you said, okay, we'll put that in. So isn't that funny?
That really is. That really is. And, you know, it's what did you see, what do you see as the second most popular? Because I'm not seeing the responses.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That was
the second
50%.
most popular is pretty close. It's 20% for people living in metropolitan areas. Closely followed by 50% for people over the age of 50. That's 17% for people over the age of 50. So
interesting. Very, very interesting. So we're thinking that people between the ages of 20 and 30 should escape relatively unscathed, and it sounds like we're thinking that people...
No, people between the ages of 30 and 50 is the highest, most likely to experience a crisis.
Yes, but people between the ages of
20 and 30. Yeah. And the lowest one is people living in rural areas. So I guess we all think that people that live in suburban and rural areas are unlikely to experience crisis.
Which kind of sounds like the grass is always greener. That's what it sounds like to me. I think it sounds like we think that if we're living in a metropolitan area and we're between the ages of 30 and 50, we've probably got a bullet on our a target rather on our chest. It would be interesting from a research perspective to compare the demographics of everyone participating in this webinar with with the answers to the polling question. Interestingly enough, there is a likelihood that spans all age groups, regardless of whether you're in a metropolitan area or you're in a rural area. Everyone has this similar likelihood, and that's because of what you now see on your screen. Think about the examples of crises that I gave right before we went into that poll. I mentioned marriage, I mentioned job change, I mentioned relocation. So when you're looking at this slide, and think about your department as we go through this, think about the demographic slant of your department, because I think you might be interested to know that in 2012, almost 2 million people got married, 1 million got divorced, 4 million babies were born, and more than 2.5 million people died just in the U.S. alone. Just in the U.S. alone. So if you start thinking about the ripple effect of those events, very ordinary life events, that's a lot of change, and a lot of potential crises. Consequently, it's highly likely, if you turn to the right or you turn to the left and you're not sitting in an office by yourself, it's highly likely the people that you're looking at, someone you know, could be a friend, a teammate, a boss, a colleague, they're experiencing a crisis right now. The scary thought is that they might not realize that they're experiencing a crisis. Because when I was talking about the research, when I was doing the research, I started to spot these trends in the interviews. And it was that the terminology was almost identical. People described themselves as, quote unquote, in a fog. They describe themselves as going through the motions, but feeling a little disconnected, a little less passionate. So, I think it's kind of interesting that these warning signs and these responses are really cutting through all age groups. So I think that when we are trying to be productive about helping people manage crises, I think we have to be open to the fact that there's a likelihood that is dispersed throughout the population. Now, it might sound like I'm a little down about this, and I don't mean to sound that way. On a positive note, thanks in part to healthier lifestyles, I think that I know that people are able to live longer. According to the CDC, the average now is 78.7 years. However, you may have also noticed economically that we've been, in a kind of a challenging environment, and people are also working longer to offset this challenging and uncertain economic condition that we're in. So what this now means is that we've got 5 generations in the workplace facing these different life-altering events, and these life-altering events can definitely affect their performance. So I think when I use the term crisis, you probably are thinking immediately serious illness or death, or, it seems to me lately, every time I turn on the news, there is some disaster, there's some train wreck, hurricane, tsunami, political unrest, terrorist attack that just creates a certain level of preoccupation in and of itself. However, not all of these life-changing events are devastating. In fact, some of them are pretty happy. The birth of a child, especially if it's the first baby in a family. Think about coworkers who are grandparents for the first time. Think about coworkers who are pregnant for the first time. Think about coworkers who are buying their first new home, or they're getting married, or they're going through an adoption. Now, there's an upside. The reason I'm defining these, what you would normally think of as happy occasions, as crises, is because they create stress and preoccupation. So now that we've got these 5 generations in the workplace, we've got a lot of potential for working with people in crises. So let me give you just really a fast example. Let's imagine that one of your team members has had a new baby, and this person's life has just irrevocably changed. I am thinking of my car mechanic, that he was the inspiration for this example. He was so looking forward to, this new addition to his life. However, if the new baby isn't sleeping through the night, neither is he. And I don't know if you've looked at any research done by the National Sleep Federation, but the average adult needs 7 to 9 hours of sleep nightly. And this is something that only about 60% of us are getting. Now, sleep is critical to rebuilding the body through cell regeneration. And there was a study done in the UK at the University of Surrey that getting less than 6 hours of sleep leads to obesity, heart disease, and diabetes. It's also been found to negatively impact judgment. This is where it impacts audit, impacts the knowledge worker, and it results in reactions that are overly emotional and or clumsy. Now, that's a little scary thought. So clearly, sleep-deprived knowledge workers are at risk of making less than optimal decisions. And I think that that's just something that could very, very easily happen. I did not include a poll slide. I probably should have, asking how many of us really were feeling sleep-deprived even right now. But going back to susceptibility to crisis, frankly, every generation of the 5 generations that are crowded together in today's workplace, they're equally likely. So, for example, in your department, if you employ interns, now some of these folks are still in school. They might be in college. If you're employing some interns at the high school level, now you might be saying, what crisis could somebody at that age possibly be facing? Well, they could be very preoccupied with their job prospects. They could be very preoccupied with funding their education, even graduating. If you're employing the recent college grads, they could be preoccupied with, well, where are they going to live? And how are they going to manage their student loan debt? Notice, by the way, as I'm mentioning these life-altering events, I'm not mentioning anything directly related to work. And that's the point. It's not just the work pressure. It's all of this stuff that is happening in a person's personal life. If some of your team members are engaged, the wedding plans could be the cause of several crises. I mean, there's a lot of decisions that have to get made. People feel pulled in a lot of directions. To the sadder side of things, if a team member is experiencing a separation or a divorce, the crisis is imminent. And older workers are just as susceptible to crises. They could be triggered by personal or family illness. They could be triggered by pre-retirement concerns. So I come back to something I said earlier. Quite frankly, the chances are there that you're currently working with somebody, either a direct report, colleague, or boss, who's experiencing a crisis. And if you're the boss, you are probably the last person to know, which is a little bit of a scary thought, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. I know we talk a lot about work-life balance as a key to nirvana, salvation. If we can only balance our life. And I know intellectually, I know that there's supposed to be a time to work and a time to play. But I'll tell you, life just doesn't turn out so neatly. I think it's very, very difficult, as the diagram shows, to separate your work life from your personal life. And that really, I think, is at the crux of this whole subject about dealing with people who are experiencing crises. I think one's personal life and one's work life are inextricably tied together. And so if one wants to be an effective compliance professional, an effective auditor, an effective manager, it's really hard to check our personal issues at the door. I mean, if you just think individually of all the roles that you have in your life, I mean, some of you are parents, some of you are siblings, you're caretakers of other people, in addition to your roles at work. And I don't know if you noticed, but I did say roles, plural, at work. Because I do think at work we're being tasked to do more with less. If we're a manager at work, we also need to be an individual contributor. So in essence, I think our plate is really quite full, really quite full. So I'd like to get your views on work-life balance. So Ashley, I'm going to turn it over to you for our third polling question.
Okay, thanks, Ann. Is achieving work-life balance a myth? Yes. It's unattainable. No, it's possible to have. Not sure. Sometimes I feel like yes. Sometimes I feel no. It's a good question. All right, we have a couple hundred votes now. I think I'll go ahead and stop the audience voting so we can take a look at the results. Thanks, everyone, for weighing in. So, and most people, are 70%, say not possible. Then we have the 24% more optimistic, favorable. Yes, it's. Oh no, I'm sorry. 70% answered B. They said it's not a myth. It is possible to have work-life balance. And then 24% said yes, work-life balance is a myth. So we have a pretty optimistic audience, actually.
I am so glad to hear that. I am so glad to hear that, because truly I think B is the answer. I think it's a bit of a tricky question, though, because I think that the word balance creates an expectation of equality, meaning, okay, balance means 50% on one side and 50% on the other side. And that's really not true. So for those people that said, yes, it's unattainable, I'm going to hope that you were thinking, oh, it has to be even 50-50. And for those of you that said, no, it is possible to have it, that is the correct answer. It's in how we approach it. So we're not going to have the same amount of time at work and at play, but the idea is to have the different spheres of our lives engaged, and that's how one gets to this concept of work-life balance. The trouble happens, and the susceptibility for crisis happens when we get out of balance. Now, and by the way, it's easy to get out of balance. I'm thinking right now in the U.S., we're near the end of the year, and it's generally like socks crunch time. I was referring to Sarbanes-Oxley, not the holiday socks that you hang by the fireplace. It's year-end. It's close to, not only the end of the month, the end of the year. A lot of additional pressures at this time of year. And so it's very possible that we can get so caught up in our own lives, in our own quote-unquote stuff, that we become unaware of what's going on around us. And I would say, sadly, but truthfully, that when a crisis occurs, typically the boss is the last one to know. And I don't know, for those of you that are Protivity subscribers, I don't know if you saw the recent poll question that was posted on the website, but if you didn't see it, I just want to tell you the question was, do you feel comfortable telling management when you're feeling a personal crisis or life-changing event? That was the polling question. Do you feel comfortable telling management when you're feeling a personal crisis or a life-changing event? And so of the respondents, 56% said no. 10 were unsure, and a third said yes. And I think that the reason first of all, I think the answer is predictable. And I think it contributes directly to why the boss is the last to know. And I think the reason is I think, fairly intuitive. The reason for this limited transparency is rooted in the respective roles of employers and employees. I mean, let's face it. As the boss controls the team member's professional mortality. That sounds terrible, but true. When you start to think about it, your manager, think about it at work, your manager has a fairly large say in your work assignments, your performance appraisal, which in turn feeds compensation decisions, which also affects decisions concerning vacation time, the training you can take, the conferences that you can attend. So I completely understand, and I'm sure you all do as well, why there would be this, for lack of a better word, opaque relationship. This lack of transparency between employees and employers. We can have friendly relationships, but there will always be a difference, and I really do not mean to sound elitist about it. I just mean to sound very, very practical. For those of you who are participating in this webinar and you are a team leader, you can try very, very hard, and you should try very, very hard to create an open and transparent work environment for your direct reports. But just know that there will always be an inherent them-us relationship. And so I think you need to do, as a manager, I think we need to do the most we can to minimize this conflict, but understand that this conflict is inherent, and it really is not something that we can eradicate. You think about it, and I think this picture sums it up. Here's this worker basically smiling. Everything is fine. I'm fine. Everything is fine. Everything's okay. And I think this happens very frequently. All too often, this goes back to the I'm in a fog comment from people who have experienced crisis, quote unquote, I'm going through the motions. Outwardly, they look okay. People in crisis look okay. They're able to mask, at least in the short run, whatever situation it is that they are facing. They show up to work. They sit at their desk. They send and respond to emails. And unless you're really monitoring the timing, amount, and quality of the output, you might never realize that the employee is in crisis until it's too late. So I think what we need to do from a practical perspective is turn our attention to what are the warning signs so that we can begin to get more astute. So Ashley, this is our fourth polling question, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Ann. So for our fourth and next to last polling question, what do you think are the behavioral warning signs of a coworker in crisis? So we talked a little bit about, I guess, changing behavior, but specific ones: A, distraction; B, anger; C, fatigue; D, missed deadlines; E, all of the above. Okay, Ann, the number's ticking up a little bit. Now let's just give people a few more minutes, a few more seconds, and then we'll go ahead and stop the voting. And let's take a look at the results. So what do we got? Well, there's an overwhelming number of votes for all of the above. And there's no votes at all for fatigue and missed deadlines, but I think 92% say all of the above. So is that what you expected, Ann?
And that is exactly what I expected. And I'm so glad, which says I think we've got a very astute set of people, because depending on the individual and depending on the situation, they can experience all or some of those symptoms. So some people, again, the pictures telling the story, where the person's there, present, seemingly, oh yeah, it's okay, I'm dealing with it, seeming neutral. But I think from a managerial perspective, we would probably notice the missed deadlines first. But there are other symptoms besides distraction, anger, fatigue, and missed deadlines. Some other symptoms are inaccurate, incomplete, or non-anticipatory responses. And when I say non-anticipatory responses, think about every time you said, I need more initiative, I need more proactivity. There are certain situations that people should be prepared for a follow-up question, and they're not prepared for a follow-up question. In fact, they might even seem blindsided. If I had to give people advice for spotting the symptoms of crisis in others, I would say, as a general rule, anytime an individual's behavior is effectively the opposite of their typical behavior, I would consider this a signal. So, for example, if one of your coworkers is typically punctual and anticipatory, very, 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 very rarely, are they late, and all of a sudden now they start to be late, they start to miss deadlines, I would consider that a symptom. Now, you might think, oh, my goodness, Ann, cut the person a slack. Everyone's late every now and then. But it's a break in behavior. And all I am suggesting that you do is start to think about what constitutes normal for the people that you are working with. And when you see a break from that, quote-unquote, normal behavior, that could be a symptom. Another warning sign could be an increase in requests to work remotely. Another warning sign could be date and time stamps at odd hours. And I'm not talking about those of you that are working in a global environment where it's typical, to get work from Singapore if you're in New York, and the timestamp will look a little odd. But anything, to sum it up, anything that is different from the person's normal behavior, it might be irritability. It might be they're no longer willing to help out. And quite frankly, the first people who are going to notice this are going to be the coworkers. I mean, if you look at this picture, the poor coworker is probably going out of his mind as he's watching this fellow in flip-flops and doing his thing. And quite frankly, the coworkers realize something is wrong largely because they are picking up the slack. Think about if you're on an audit with somebody else and all of a sudden they're not doing their part. They're not getting the aspects of the audit done that you thought they were going to get done. Well, who's going to do it? You know, typically it's the coworker that's picking up the slack. And it's also interesting to note that typically coworkers do not go to the boss to complain about their peers because they expect the boss to manage the situation. Coworkers expect the team's leader to make sure that everybody on the team has a comparable workload and is held to a common performance standard. Now, I just think it would be interesting to see, think about people that you know who have been in a crisis, don't name names, but think about people you know, and what have you done? So this is our last polling slide. Ashley, I'm turning it over to you.
Okay. Final question. When you notice the warning signs of a coworker in crisis, what did you do? Let me get the vote started here. A, did you pick up their slack? B, did you tell a manager? C, did you pretend everything was fine? D, both A and B. E, okay. I think we're up to our usual number of voters, and so I'll go ahead and I'll stop the audience voting here so I can tell you about the results. Oh, wow, it's pretty even. The biggest answer, the most popular answer is D with 36%, and that is both A and B. You picked up the slack and you told a manager. And then with 22% of the answers, both A and C. So these are people that picked up the slack and pretended everything was fine, but didn't tell a manager. That was 22%.
So probably the people that told a manager did a smart thing because they reduced their own stress. And that goes back to my comment before about there's an expectation that managers, team leads, are going to manage the workflow. I mean, it's in the name. It creates this expectation. So especially, audit's very interesting because the work does not get done in the audit department typically. A lot of the work gets done in different areas. So it's not, it's really hard to know what is going on at a particular, site unless the manager is there. And the likelihood of that, depending on the types of audits you have, the size of your audit department, that really varies. I included this poll question because I think this question is more about your own individual response to these types of circumstances. And the key point I wanted to make about these answers, and I'm repeating myself now, is if you pretended like everything was fine, you are potentially at risk for getting yourself into a crisis. And so I just wanted to not hit too close to home here, but by not telling everyone, by pretending that everything is okay, that causes the situation to continue longer and actually potentially worsen. When individuals are going through a crisis and we don't know the duration of the crisis, it could go on for months. It could go on for a really, really long time. When no one says anything to the person, no one reaches out to the person who's now missing deadlines, submitting substandard work, or incomplete work, it really has a deleterious or harmful effect on the total group. And that's why here I'm talking about the hands-off manager. This is the person who very infrequently or sporadically gets involved. These managers are the most at risk. They will not realize that there's been degradation in the team member's performance, typically until it's too late to salvage the situation. And the sad part of this is even the most engaged manager is still generally the last person to notice, but the engaged manager still stands a better chance. I wanted to share this perspective, this diagram on perspectives on employee performance with you, because this happens all of the time. This has turned out time and time again. So let me just explain what this diagram is showing. If you look at the y-axis where you see the performance is going in a negative direction over time. But notice the steep incline is greater, meaning the employee's performance is actually worse than the manager's perception. Now, obviously, if the manager had been staying in close contact with all of the team members, that manager, the engaged manager, would have noticed, hey, other team members are picking up the slack. And they would have been able to act sooner. And in this particular case, when it comes to employee performance, time is not your friend. You really want to be able to jump on things as quickly as possible. So we've talked so far, we've talked about the warning signs, we've talked about who's susceptible to experience crisis, we've talked about the hands-off manager being most at risk, but frankly, it's the coworkers who'll be picking up the slack. I now want to go to the practical side and talk about what can you do about it. So I think it's really important to understand your employees' quote-unquote normal behavior so that you can be very, very adaptive to get the most and the best, and also understand when there has been a break in that behavior so that you can intervene early. The second thing I think that's very important to do, especially for those of you in audit shops where you have rotational leadership, meaning one job, you're the in charge, on another job, somebody else is the in charge, I think it's really important to articulate what the performance goals are, what the deadlines are, and then follow up. For those of you that have administrative responsibility, meaning you got to do the performance appraisals, I do think it's important to check in much more regularly than annually. I really think it's important to leverage the post-audit team reviews if you have them, just because it'll give you very contemporary information and it'll make it easy to see slippage and negative change in performance. The third thing, I think it's important to have regular one-on-one meetings. By the way, these things don't have to be 3 hours in length. They don't have to be, go on and on and on. I mean, they might be as short as 30-minute sessions, 15-minute sessions. They could be by phone if you're geographically challenged. I mean, some folks might have auditors who are spread out, and it's not convenient to get to be face-to-face. You could do it by Skype, but I do think that it's important as a way of getting to know what normal is. And that takes me back to reinforcing point one, because how do you get to know what normal is if we're not all working together all the time? Because let's face it, in audit, a lot of us are on the road. The fourth suggestion that I would make is get comfortable with open, I'm calling it here reprisal-free, meaning get comfortable with creating an open, transparent climate within your organization so that people feel comfortable bringing things up. You know, some of these crises are very personal in nature, and there are many individuals. I mean, over the years, I have probably trained tens of thousands of people, and it never ceases to amaze me that there are folks out there who feel that there should be a wall between their personal lives and their work life. They share very little, and this is by design. And these folks are real because they don't feel that if they were to share things, it could be used against them. And so that's what I mean by creating a reprisal-free atmosphere, so that when people are experiencing these life-changing events, particularly those of a personal nature, like a divorce, for example, or the death of a loved one or serious illness, they can feel more comfortable bringing it up. Because the key to all of this is timely recognition that there is a problem. The fifth technique is intervening early. So once you spot this change, I think there's a tendency to say, oh, it's probably my imagination. It's probably my imagination. Or I don't want to, be managing too closely. I don't want to look like a hard nose. But quite frankly, the more time you let go by, the more the situation worsens. So I do think that whether you're a coworker or you are a manager, I think you need to be prepared to intervene, to start up a conversation. I think it's really important, once we get the crisis out in the open, you can't do number 6 until the crisis is out in the open. Now we need to focus on, just as if it were an audit concern, what's going to be the corrective action. And that corrective action needs to focus on behaviors that the individual can do something about. Similarly, I mean, it's analogous to the corrective actions that we would expect for any controlled deficiency anytime the residual risk is too high. We've got to make sure that the plan that we're coming up with is something that the person can actually implement. The 7th technique is really a takeaway on an individual level. I mean, how effectively do you listen? How often do you talk over people? How effectively do you observe changes in behavior? Because if you're really not effective there, well, then I don't think you can really do most of the 6 actions that I've already proposed. The key to all of this, if I had to really sum it up, is know what normal is and intervene early. Well, if you don't have good listening skills or observation skills, it's going to be a little problematic. The last piece is, these crises don't come on overnight generally, and they don't end overnight. So I think we have to figure out what's going to be the timeline during which, the person has a new baby. That's like at least an 18-year commitment. What are we going to do there? And we need to balance we need to get work done is what I'm trying to say. Even though the person's going through a crisis, we cannot lose sight of it. So putting it all together, if you're the manager, you need to take preemptive and empathic actions. If you are a coworker, I still think you can be preemptive. I think you can demonstrate empathy, and the idea is to encourage the person to open up, to discuss what's going on, so that we can come out with a corrective action plan that is viable. So I guess putting it in the vernacular, you can't control the wind, but you can set the direction. So when you're dealing with these changes, control what you can, and that is recognizing that there's been a change in behavior, intervening, and then moving towards a viable corrective action plan. Now, I said we were going to take some time for questions. I don't know if there are any questions.
I do have some questions for you, Ann, so thank you for leaving a few minutes. And these are really good questions, too, some that I had myself as I was going along. 2 of them are related. One says, I'm a boss, and I believe being open to your subordinates by sharing your own crises with them will help you in understanding, that maybe that would help them open up to you. Do you think that's true? Or a related question, how can managers make themselves more approachable to employees in a crisis, maybe if you're not in a crisis yourself?
So I want to start with the second part of that question. How can managers make themselves more approachable? You would be surprised. You'd be probably shocked at how many team leads do not say good morning to people. I mean, it's astounding. You cannot believe how many people have closed doors. I wouldn't even call it closed door policy. So, and you might say, well, why are you bringing that up? Well, the key to approachability is to be available and especially if you're geographically not proximate, it gets even more difficult. But that would be a very easy step, to physically say good morning to people, to physically say, how's it going? And not the how's it going as you're walking by them at 50 miles an hour with your cup of coffee in hand, but actually, how's it going? And really taking a moment to take in their facial expression, take in how they're looking, just like a real quick check-in. With regard to sharing, I think sharing is great as long as it's done like anything else in moderation. And I think that the emphasis needs to be not sharing so much the gory details of what you went through, but rather sharing different approaches you used to deal with the situation. Because we don't want to make this a competition in terms of whose crisis is worse. If a person's going through a crisis and somebody comes up to them and says, oh, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. When so-and-so died, this is what happened to me. Or when I was sick, it's like, wait a minute. Where's your listening? The focus now just went on you, and it came off them.
Right.
So the focus, you can mention, yes, sadly, I've gone through something similar. How are you feeling now? And how are you trying to deal with it now? And then you can make your suggestions about the techniques that you used.
Good. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, someone asked if it's possible for an individual to have none of the symptoms. You mentioned the symptoms of missing deadlines and anger, and, do you think that some people have no symptoms?
I'm thinking about that question. I think that there are some people who are more private than others, so it's harder to spot deviations from their normal, or the range between, facially, think about their facial expressions, the range between feeling wildly euphorically happy and wildly upset is very narrow, meaning they almost look the same, depending on, despite their emotion. Nonetheless, I think that you can see warning signs if you're paying attention. I have a hard time imagining someone with no warning signs at all. Yeah. Everybody's style morphs a little bit.
Mm-hmm. There's two kind of questions from an auditor perspective. One is, as an auditor, how do you deal with a crisis like this in the organization? And the second question that's similar is, can a crisis lead to a fraud within the organization, either financial or non-financial? What do you think about those?
So, again, starting with the second question first, I definitely see a correlation between crisis and that giving way to motivation being part of that three-legged stool, the other two being rationalization and opportunity. So the opportunity clearly would be, if segregation of duties wasn't what it should be, or people were overly cross-trained, but I see a direct correlation, between people in crises and potential for fraud. I do see a correlation, and from an audit perspective, this whole topic I think keys directly to the control environment, because this keys to leadership, this keys to decision making, and I do think when I've written on auditing soft controls, I do think that this is something that we should be looking for.
So thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this food for thought. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon and rest of your week. And thanks again, Ann.
You're welcome. Thanks.